Richard, welcome back to Austin Next.
It's great to be back with you, Jason. Thanks for having me back.
So, we're going to start off by diving into this new piece that you have, this kind of new theory of the meta city. So, can you describe for the audience, what is the meta city?
Yeah, but first, it's probably worth, like, when you say that, it sounds like it came out as a new theory. It's almost like, in a way, when I wrote Rise of the Creative Class, like that took 3 or 4 years to become like a theory or to like congeal in my mind. What I typically do is I start describing something and writing down a description and then building out like a typology, and the theory doesn't come till later. I'm very inductive instead of deductive. That's the way I work. And so I was working with these consultants at BCG, who are the co-authors. A guy named Vlad Borchenko and another guy named Antoine Vertrano, and they're very involved, like on the ground, with cities in Europe, in the Middle East, and there's also another team I work with in BCG that works in the US and North America. So, we're talking, right, back and forth, like you and I do, and we're talking about the rise of remote work. And I guess the light bulb that went off in my head, which I think you and I talked about too before, is that remote work doesn't have to mean the end of cities, or it doesn't even have to mean the end of like superstar cities or urban hubs, that you can have more remote work and you can have people dispersing. But that could also mean that these hubs take on a new and maybe more important role. So what was interesting is, you're looking for data to try to figure out patterns, right? And you're trying to, and I said to the guys at BCG, it's so funny, like you and I, we talk like this on Zoom, like one's in London, one's in the Middle East. Like we'd never met in person. So, we're talking like this on a Zoom or whatever it is. And I said, have you guys seen the LinkedIn data? And they're like, yeah. And I said, I was looking at the LinkedIn data because I was looking at Austin and San Francisco or Miami and New York. We'll get to that. Or Nashville and Los Angeles. And they said, well, we have that data. I'm like, what? Like, oh, yeah, we bought access to the LinkedIn data that no one else has because we use it in our reports. They write this big report on global cities. And I said, what if we were to look at talent flows? Because the LinkedIn data that is published just goes for like a city and its connected cities. But they had it for like not every city in the world, but loads and loads of global cities. I said, what if we looked at the way these cities were connected through talent flows? And when we did that, it became much more obvious to us that we were onto something. So that's where we got, and we can go into it deeper. That's where we got the idea of a new kind of city, which isn't just a physical artifact. So that's how we got there.
So you start at the talent flows, and that gets into the question of, okay, so when you're thinking about this meta city, and you said, what is this meta city on top of the physical city? And you started with the talent, but yep. So what is it that's being exchanged then?
We were, and then like the light bulb went off. And again, you're dealing with consultants who are really dealing with this in practice, right? So they're dealing with how does a city position itself for remote work? What does a city do to attract remote workers? They're advising these cities in a way I'm not, right? I'm a thought leader, academic, intellectual, whatever. And so the idea that went off between the three of us was, for all of human history, cities have been mainly a physical artifact. And, I'm the one who said it. Oh, shit. The definition of a metropolitan area is a shared labor market. Like, so you have to be physically co-located, a place that people live and work. They live different places and they work. And in the past, right, until relatively recently, people lived in suburbs, commuted to a downtown core. Of course, then we saw the rise of edge cities and, suburban office parks and patterns like Los Angeles or Austin. Not every city was like New York or San Francisco or Boston, Chicago, Pittsburgh. So then kind of the idea went off, what if a city now is a physical artifact with a set of virtual connections or these digital connectivity? And at the same time, I'm just giving credit. I was talking to two relatively well-known academics, Mike Storper and Andres Rodriguez-Pose, and I was kind of saying, we were talking about writing something else. We had written a paper on COVID in cities, and we still might do it. And, Michael said, what you're talking about, Richard, is a new kind of urban periphery. Cities have always had peripheries. They were just physically connected. You're talking about it, and then it was like, oh shit! Like we think that this isn't, because the literature was either cities are going to die and everyone's going to move remote, or conversely, remote workers weren't going to be able to work remote. They're all going to have to move back. And we said, no, maybe there's a new pattern. And there's another thing, folks, Jason, that economic geographers, there's a concept. Now, we don't talk about it because it's a Harvard business, that we've always talked about in economic geography called the spatial division of labor. That cities occupy positions in it, like economists have a division of labor. Geographers said there's a spatial division of labor with different cities for headquarters, cities for innovation centers, cities for call centers, cities for and it's more complicated than that, but you get the picture. So I began to puzzle about what if this was a new way of organizing the spatial division of labor, that there was this physical cluster with a set of digital hinterlands, or a set of, so a city for the first time could be a physical artifact with a set of digital connections. And then when we looked at the LinkedIn data, it wasn't a random pattern. You know what I'm saying? That New York, that you couldn't understand Miami without understanding and I know this because I spend the winter in Miami. I know my friends who get on a plane every week and go to New York to work. And, I hear people complaining, right? And people saying, oh God, now I'm going to have to go back to New York because I want to switch a job and I want to live here because I like the nice weather, but I don't want to move back there. So I'm trying to negotiate it. And then, the same thing became clear with Austin and San Francisco, that there was, when I looked at the data, San Francisco was the number one place that Austin people were going. Same. And when I looked at Nashville, I do a lot of work in Nashville for Vanderbilt University in the city. I know the mayor. Nashville had the same kind of relationship with LA. And then, so folks, what we did was we looked at, say, for the top, I forget if it was 25, 35, or 50. It's in the article. But we looked at some set of global cities, ranked not by their size, but by their talent connections, their flows of people. And what happened was New York and London immediately came out as the two top cities with the most connections to other cities, right? So how much talent is flowing in and out? But what was so interesting was the next group. The next group, second tier, we called them talent. The top were the superstars. The next, we called them talent hubs. But, you would expect in that group to see Hong Kong and LA and Frankfurt. What you saw was the next two were Dubai, Singapore, and Dublin in that group, and then Paris and LA. Now, I forget the exact, I know Dubai was third. I forget the exact order of the others, but I was like, Dubai and Vlad, who works in the Middle East, goes, that makes perfect sense. Dubai is attracting all of these people from England or from Canada, expats, but it's also like the place Arabic people who live in the Arab Middle East come to work. And he's like, my buddy, we actually wrote about the guy who commutes from home in Beirut and commutes there. So, and then what about Singapore? Oh, well, Singapore's invested in an airport and become a hub for talent. It's a big Asian city. And then we said, oh my God, like those two examples in Dublin were the ones that triggered us. Like, how could Dubai and Singapore and Dublin be? Now, I want to say this. This is not a ranking of the power of global cities. Tokyo would be a very powerful, it is a ranking of talent connections among these meta cities. And that was what was interesting to us. They occupied the second category, and they were, they had, were in a higher category than Toronto or Frankfurt or Stockholm or Amsterdam. And so we look, is this the be all and end all? Do we have fundamental proof? No, but we had enough proof to say this looks like an emergent kind of city that is both physical and digital. It aligns with the whole idea of remote work. It's a first piece. And, I think we might write more on it and try to develop it more. But it's interesting. It caught on. Like, people are like, yeah, like this makes sense to me. It makes sense to me to think like this. So we think we're onto something. And it was an interesting thing to publish.
Well, to your point about the spatial, economic spatial division of labor. And one of the things that's kind of bothered me a bit about this argument about remote work and we have to be in the office or not is, to your point, is we've been doing remote, however you want to describe it, or
Correct.
For a long time, because when you say like, okay, well, I'm in the office in Austin and you're in the office in Miami and you're in the office in London, like that's remote. I don't care if we're all in offices or we're all in tiny, like we're still doing some sort of piece of remote. And there is that, as you said, it's the meta on top of it that's driving those
And when I
different
think
types
of
of
a spatial
connections.
division of labor, I think like you, like Austin and Miami and Nashville didn't come out of nowhere. They came out of a historical set of relationships. Now, I'm lucky enough, as we talked about, I know Austin because I went there a lot, and I know your current mayor and I know your Chamber of Commerce. And I used to talk at the 360 Summit, and Austin was a big inspiration to my book. Right? So I know the place. And I remember it was probably Pike Powers who said this to me. I'm not sure, but I think it was Pike. We'd have these missions every year to Silicon Valley to tell those companies to come to Austin. Like, okay, so you've been doing that for 40 years. You have a fabric of, now I know enough about Miami to know that what Miami has been doing for a long time is attracting people from New York. You don't call someplace the sixth borough for like no reason.
Right.
So Miami has always had this, and because of the migration of Cuban bankers, right, to Miami a long time ago, it's always been a financial center for Latin America. But, New Yorkers would come here when they get older and tighter of the cold. So yeah, it wasn't, and that's when people said Miami's a tech hub. I'm like, no, yeah, there's some of these guys but really Miami is a financial hub tied to New York and also with Ken Griffin to Chicago, but Ken Griffin really has a presence in New York. And the same thing with Nashville. I know Nashville a lot. I've been writing, I love music scenes like the Austin scene. And it was very clear to me that Nashville has long established ties to LA. It's just something that has been there for a long time. And so, yeah, it's not just merged with remote. There's always been the spatial division of labor. And then with remote work, it went, oh, all these people are moving. And there was a whole narrative, right? Moving away from the blue cities and the regulations and the governance and all this bullshit, all this baloney. But what you find now is that New York is even stronger as a financial center. And, Austin is a real tech hub. I've always said this. Austin is very different than Miami. Don't lump them together. But, San Francisco now, when you look at it in AI, looks like the place to be. Even now we've seen these mea culpas, right? I think you probably saw the one in the Wall Street Journal. Oops, we got it wrong. San Francisco's back. It's this incredible sense of AI talent. And it's, even with all the problems, it's coming back again strong. And I think thinking about Austin and San Francisco together, thinking about Miami and New York together, thinking about LA and Nashville together is a better way of thinking about it than all these independent spatial division of labor. They're not all these independent little nodes. These places are kind of connected in a fabric that when you think about it has some logic and structure underpinning it.
Well, I do think the Wall Street Journal article was interesting. There were two comments on that. One where I agreed and one where I disagreed. One is I do have a fundamental where I'm still very much, I'm in the process of trying to come up with my own theory of ecosystems and in that kind of inductive phase where just pulling it together. And I think there are first principles of ecosystems and they change over time. And so the part where I definitely agree with the Wall Street Journal article is if you want to be building foundational AI models, you better be in San Francisco. Like if you're not there trying to do that, I mean, possibly like Toronto, like you can do that outside of it, but generally speaking, you should be there. The part that I want to push back against on the Wall Street Journal article is it was a very anecdotal article. Yeah. It was like, oh, all these people, it's like, and this one person moved back or this one person opened an office. So the one piece, it was a little bit like, oh, here you have this. So
let's play this out. Let's play this out. So the first thing we would use to better understand this is Ray Vernon was a brilliant academic. He was actually much older. He's deceased. But like me, a working class person, I believe Ray was a boxer in his early life and wrote many great articles. He became famous for an article he wrote a long time ago in the 40s or 50s on sticky wages. But he wrote this piece called The Product Cycle Model of Roughly Economic Development. And in that piece, he argued, he didn't call it a spatial division of labor, but he said, innovation occurs in certain kinds of places. Detroit in his day, in auto. But as a technology becomes stable or standard, Silicon Valley in our time, San Francisco Bay Area, as a technology becomes stable or standard, it can be moved outside that place. And for many of us, that was a way to understand the decline of Detroit or Pittsburgh, that they developed these ecosystems based on the linkage of innovation and production. But and that was very critical to the early phase of auto or steel or electron, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But as those industries matured and the technology became stable, you could create branch plans. People would argue a long time ago that North Carolina Research Triangle, and even Austin in its early days, were branch plan economies for companies like HP or IBM. But I want to update that. It's not like innovation ecosystems are stuck in place. And let me give you the example that I think helps advance what you're thinking about. I'm from New Jersey. New Jersey was the technological capital in electronics, in telephones, home to Bell Labs, home to RCA, invention of many of the technologies, early semiconductor advantages, flat panel displays at RCA, none of which grew in New Jersey. What happened, of course, as you know, is that Bell Labs, sometime in the 1950s, a group of people at Bell Labs, led by Bill Shockley at the time, decided they wanted to move. They moved to a place called Silicon Valley for a whole bunch of reasons we need not, but they moved. And Silicon Valley had an electronics infrastructure, had a lot of defense contracting. You know, Fred Terman had moved there from MIT and began to build up electrical engineering at Stanford. But the point was, in the early days of Silicon Valley, there wasn't an innovation ecosystem. They were importing capital from the coast. People like Arthur Rock, the legendary venture capitalist, was coming from New York. And they were raising, and then all of a sudden, I think it was when people left Fairchild under Shockley, decided they were going to form Intel. The people just got tired of Shockley, and obviously not a very nice person. But the really smart people decided we're going to build a company that we participate in, that we have equity in. And then people like Art Rock and Tommy Davis and early venture capital said, we're going to build a venture capital limited partnership model. Silicon Valley built an ecosystem. So it's not like you're locked in. Nashville's my other example that I love. You know, who would have thought that this little place that promoted country music, you know, Hee Haw and the Grand Ole Opry, all of a sudden could become this really full-blown musical ecosystem, and they did it. So yes, ecosystems are not locked in place. And I think, you know, you're probably thinking about Austin. I would say Austin is probably an eco. It's not quite the Bay Area yet, but in contrast to Miami, and I'm not trying to despair, I think Miami has a great financial ecosystem.
Right.
But as a tech ecosystem, when I look across the board, yeah, Austin to me looks like it has an ecosystem. Maybe it's not quite the Bay Area yet, but so I think the point is there's a spatial division of labor. There are incumbent innovation centers, but new ones can arise. And especially if the old ones start to hit, like what happens is, the other thing, sorry for this big academic soliloquy, you know, a guy named Mansur Olson, you know, wrote this famous book called The Rise and Decline of Nations. And he said the reason nations decline is this institutional sclerosis. When the things that propelled them to economic greatness become constraints. And he wrote an essay later on called, you know, Why Regions Grow and Decline. And in that, he was predicting the growth of the Sun Belt ages ago, saying the North had become rigid and sclerotic, and he didn't like unions. I mean, I could punch holes in his argument, but the point was, when regions decline is when they become sclerotic, and then new regions can overtake their position. The way I would look at this is we now have enough room for lots of different ecosystems plugged into a spatial division of labor.
And I also think it's interesting with these different networks and regional connections, right? To your point with like Pike Powers and everybody, and the Texas model for a long time had been this go forth and evangelize the model and bring in people and pull them in. And it was very much, as you kind of put it in the piece, about its rise as a satellite. And the talent in Austin, the pieces that were here were of the kind of the second order. You had the customer service, and then you start seeing product managers, then you start seeing engineers and the like. And then I think one of the other things that was interesting is, especially since the COVID wave, is this, you know, a lot of like New York was the influence coming in, and LA. So it was almost these kind of stacked webs of networks. So it wasn't just the Silicon Valley, which then brings a whole, it wasn't just talent, it was different types of models, different types of innovation, which I think becomes a different type of ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think for me, being in Pittsburgh around the people who invented artificial intelligence. I mean, we talk about Toronto. I'm a professor at Toronto, but you know, where does Jeff Hinton come from? Carnegie Mellon. Mm-hmm. You know, there are two real constellations of serious artificial intelligence talent. There's MIT around Marvin Minsky, and there's Carnegie Mellon around Herbert Simon and Alan Newell and others. where Jeff Hinton leaves. I mean, Jeff Hinton leaves in 1980 because he's a Brit who's left-leaning and doesn't like Ronald Reagan and doesn't like the Defense Department. Where's he going to go? Toronto. Makes sense. So my theory always comes of, why didn't Pittsburgh? Why not Pittsburgh? Why not New Jersey? Why Silicon Valley? Why Austin? And I think that technical talent is critical, but it's not the differentiator. And then people search around for what is the differentiator. And a lot of them seize on venture capital. But no, capital flows to talent. The critical differentiator are people who can make, it's the Schumpeterian entrepreneur. This unique Steve Jobs-like person, let's just use Steve Jobs as that example, who can walk into Xerox Palo Alto Research Center and go, oh shit, there's an Ethernet, there's a keyboard, there's a mouse, there's a screen. Oh, somehow there's something in that brain that says, we put that all together in something called an Apple Macintosh. Like, that is kind of a genius. That is the talent that's in short supply. And I think what the Bay Area has been able to do, is capitalize on those serial entrepreneurs. Like, it just has been a magnet for the people with that capability. Now, they're not from the Bay Area. They're from New York. They're from Texas. They're from Toronto. They're from Quebec. They're from India. They're from China. But somehow that group of people, it's like Taylor Swift. I mean, I hate this to God. Why did I even use it? But telling her mom and dad when she's 11, all of the people who do this for a living move to National Mall. Like, it's an intuitive thing. It's not like all of these people who build this shit are going to Silicon Valley. I'm going there too. I'll figure out a way to get myself into Stanford. I think that's the constraint that's been so hard in the ecosystem. And I do think that something happened with the pandemic, that some subset of that group of people said, I don't have to live here anymore. And I think what's even more interesting is the young generation said, yeah, I like San Francisco and it's a great place, but it's super expensive and I got to bang my head against the wall and maybe I can live somewhere else. So yes, there was some dissemination of that talent to some degree.
Well, and what's really fascinating is how quickly some of these new networks and connections can be created, right? And we were talking about right before we came on this concept of the gundo, which just really came into the zeitgeist from El Segundo, right? And so and I'm working on getting some people on the podcast to talk about that. So El Segundo, for people who kind of don't know in the pod, is a really small city within within kind of the Los Angeles metro that nobody really lives there. It's kind of this small part on the coast. It's Northrop is there. I think Lockheed is there. A historical background of kind of a lot of space and aerospace and defense. I actually lived nearby in kind of the South Bay from 2011 to 2013. And I never would have thought of it as a kind of dynamic startup hub environment. In the last couple of months, all sorts kind of threw into the zeitgeist that suddenly was, it's the gundo. There's this huge startup environment there. It's all hard tech, defense, aerospace. They're building a bunch of stuff. There was this all throughout. There was the hackathon a week ago, and you saw all of these Andreessen, Horowitz, 8VC. They were all going down for this Founders Fund. So you saw like this almost instantaneous meta-city kind of connection between, as you said, the capital will go where the talent is. The capital flocked down to the gundo real fast, and you just saw it to kind of that narrative build up. And it's amazing how in today's environment, you point with remote work and everything, how I hadn't heard of El Segundo being a sub-regional hub for this more than 2 months ago.
Yeah, nor had I. I'd never heard it until you told me about it. I hadn't heard about it. So I think you're right. And I think one of the things that we focused on clusters as self-contained entities, but I think you're right that the real interesting part is that it's not the cloud, it's not the cluster. The real interesting part is the network of connections. That's the real interesting part. And that's the way places grow, especially places that are not dominant places. They don't grow just from creating something on their own. They grow by nurturing, thinking really strategically about how to grow themselves in relationship to other places. But that's the way the United States grew as an economic power, developing relationships to Germany and the UK. And moving technology from the England and Germany into the United States. And so there's nothing new. It is relationships and it's networks. I mean, Manuel Castells was onto this a long time ago that, the space of flows, cities as networks. I mean, it was arcane and it was hard for practitioners to understand. Annalise Saxenian, in her incredible work on diasporas and saying it's not brain drain, it's not brain drain, it's not brain gain, it's brain circulation. And what the Bay Area was is circulating Asian and Indian tech, and then they go back with those relationships and create little diasporic hubs in Asia and in India. So people have pointed to this before. I think what's really interesting, though, is if you look at the two places that have really gained share in venture capital finance startups over the past decade, unfortunately, Austin is still relatively small. So the share gain hasn't been a lot. But if you look at the places that have gained the most share, it's been New York and LA. And, as Jane Jacobs always would say, affordable space matters. New ideas require old, that metaphor, new ideas require old buildings. The Bay Area wasn't expensive at one time. And even downtown San Francisco was not expensive at one time. Those neighborhoods were underpopulated. They were undesirable. We've seen what's happened now. So yeah, it's not surprising to me that people find a spot to go. And as you said, knowing El Segundo much better than me, it had a legacy of advanced technological production and innovation. So it had capacity, and then entrepreneurs discover it. People who build things discover it and nurture those relationships, so it becomes a growth hub. Yeah, it's not surprising. And that, why does it happen in El Segundo? Why does it happen in Nashville, not elsewhere? Why does it, happen in Silicon Valley at one point in time and not New Jersey? Who knows, but it does.
Well, I think there are two things. One, I've got some data. I'm going to push back on that, the growth. But the thing that I really love about is I think narratives really matter. From a naming convention, I love that they're calling it the Gundo.
Me too.
From the perspective of they didn't call it Silicon X, whatever that was.
Sorry.
Is that they realized that we are creating something new. And the sooner people were starting to break out of the Silicon Alley, Silicon Beach, Silicon whatever, is back to we're creating something new and different.
Nashville didn't call itself the next LA either.
Right.
It called itself Nashville. And I think the next Silicon somewhere, it just makes sure that it reinforces your second or third tier status. So 100%.
Yes.
Narrative and branding, and then not just narrative, backing that up. You not only need great branding and great marketing, you need a great product. Right. So doing both at the same time. And yeah.
Now they're on everybody's radar. So now it's your point. Now they got to back it up and actually build, and we'll see where they go.
Gundo's pretty good I agree with you. It's pretty good.
So now the data perspective, I found it was, we're seeing all the raw data, but I was curious. And so I did an analysis where I benchmarked everybody's 2019 venture funding. So to your point, we can see share, but I was curious to see where everyone was kind of pre and post bubble. And it was interesting to me when this was based on PitchBook, and I saw where it was. If you looked at where everyone was 2019 to where they ended up at 2023, there were only 4 cities from the top 10 that were above 19. It was Silicon Valley, Boston, DC, which actually that surprised me, and Austin.
None of that surprises me.
Everybody else, this includes LA, New York, Chicago, Miami, they all were at basically between 18 and 19 levels. So everyone had not only fallen, but fallen behind where they were pre-pandemic. So I thought that was just an interesting analysis, looking at kind of the momentum that people were able to take from the
people
peak
like
of the
Brad
surf era.
Feld or Ian Hathaway would caution, though, that venture capital data in the short term is notoriously limited. So wait a couple of years till it's updated. But I don't have any reason to think your analysis is wrong. I think, we probably talked about this last time. I did an analysis where we actually went back to 1995 levels. Did we talk about this?
I think a little bit, yeah.
I did this report where I went back to 1995 levels. And look, these data are really hard to compare. And then with all this stuff said, every caveat under the moon. But, we found that there were like 20 places, roughly, that were the equivalent or larger than what Silicon Valley was in 1995. And more than that were bigger than Boston. So the point is that we have a lot of functional startups. Yeah. I could qualify everything by saying these are the dominant ones, but we probably have 25 to 50 places in the United States that are for reals. And could, with the appropriate nurturing and the appropriate, you know what I'm saying, all the stuff, the care and feeding, development of the networks, emerge as big time. But, no one does that. They say, oh, look, Austin is small relative, or, whatever. Right. Ann Arbor, Boulder is small relative. But, in real terms, some of these places are bigger than the Bay Area was. And 1995, look, that's not that long ago. Most of the big tech companies we talk about today, many of them were around then. So that's, we just have many, many, many more viable startup ecosystems. And the question is, how do you break through? And do you need to? I mean, maybe you don't even need to. Maybe the Bay Area stays dominant for our lives. I don't know. Maybe it doesn't. But maybe you don't need to. Maybe you just build up the capabilities you have. You know what I'm saying? And build around those and build your own community, which you call yours, not the next Silicon somewhere.
So when we're thinking about the meta cities, and you talk about, a key kind of phrase you said is you can't see a lot of these cities without thinking about them as kind of satellites of others, right? The rise of Miami and Austin without seeing their relationships to New York and the Bay. But we've seen, look, financial institutions put satellite offices everywhere. Silicon Valley tech giants put other offices everywhere.
Yep.
Why is it that there really seems to be a special relationship between Austin and the Valley and Miami and New York? I can't really put my finger on any other city pairings like those two.
Nashville and LA.
Okay.
Would be the other one that would be, it's history. It's the fact that people from the Bay Area long ago started moving to Austin. Like it or not, Austin shares many of the same, and I'm not trying to impugn them, liberal, more open-minded. It's different than the rest of Texas. I'm not trying to impugn. It's just like it was a university town. It's more open-minded. It's liberal-oriented. It's kind of blue. I mean, it's not as crazy as Berkeley or, it has a vibe. Similarly with Miami, it's type A. There, and of course, there's a Latin thing, but Miami used to always been referred to as God's waiting room, the place that, elderly more, it has a large Jewish community. It has a vibe that's, I feel it, people talking like this all the time in Miami. Like and I think Nashville developed this with LA differently, maybe because it was country music, but then people from LA. So I think there's all sorts of things that we could point to, but it's not just economic. There's a cultural, like when you say to people from San Francisco, no matter what some of the Founders Fund people say, would you move to Miami? They look at you like you're insane. When you say to somebody from New York, oh yeah, in a minute, I moved to Miami. It's great. I go there all the time. The same thing when you say to somebody like LA, no, Miami's not my thing, but I like Nashville or Austin. I think there's a cultural similarity that grows up over time that helps explain it, but I don't know. I mean, we need like cultural and political people to help us understand that better.
It's just been interesting.
The other thing I will just say, look, I never thought about this until you mentioned it. If I take my creative class measure or substitute that with people with a college degree, and those things are very closely correlated, the two places that come out high on that are the Bay Area and Austin. And Boulder. Miami is at the low end. And maybe to be a technology center, you need more of these university-oriented, research-oriented, more highly educated human. Where in finance and real estate, it's more like working class grit. Not that you don't have to be smart, but it's not necessarily book smarts. It's like working class grit, chutzpah. And New York and Miami share that. Now, New York has a higher creative class quotient. And LA and Nashville are quite similar, although Nashville has been adding creative class and adding bachelors. But maybe it's as simple as their human capital endowment or their human capital level. The places have more highly educated, more creative class speak the same language, where places that are more, and it's sectoral, right?
Mm-hmm.
Certain sectors depend on certain skills. I've never thought about this before, but I think you make a really super interesting point.
And when we're seeing them now the question is, we see those connections happening, and that pairing, as you said, between those six cities, and they're tightly connected. But then, at least I'm seeing here in Austin, especially, and then this we talked about a lot last time, with the physical meets the digital, right? We're building a lot more. The manufacturing element is becoming a much larger key element of the Austin ecosystem, and obviously not so much of the Silicon Valley. As the innovation models and the sectors start to diverge, what then happens with the meta city model?
Well, let's go back to your innovation and production thing, and then we'll move on from there. I mean, in 1990, I wrote this book called The Breakthrough Illusion: Why America Makes the Breakthroughs Don't Follow Through, talking about this disconnect between innovation and production, and focusing on these high-tech, I didn't call them high-tech hubs, clusters, whatever we called them then, districts, and the fact that manufacturing was moving offshore, and that was a disaster, right? And then over the next 30 years, we basically built a model which was premised upon that until we realized that we can't do that anymore. So look, I'm super heartened by the movement back of manufacturing to the North American continent. A lot of that has been in Mexico, and I think Mexico can play a bigger role in that, into the United States and into the heartland. And, I wrote a whole report on that. I think the heartland, from Detroit to Austin and everything in between, is where we're going to make stuff. That's the part of the country that's good at making stuff, that has the infrastructure to make stuff that you don't do in the coast. It's expensive to do on the coast. It's the wrong place to do it, is on the coast. So I'm heartened. I'm heartened by the move to place-based industrial policy under the Biden administration. So yeah, I think that's great. Look, to be honest with you, so I'll be super honest with you. I saw these two things as separate projects. I have a MetaCity project, and I have a kind of reinvention of the Heartland manufacturing project. I was talking to my literary agent, and I said, "Is there a book in the MetaCity?" And he said, "Yes." He had no idea I was interested in the same thing. The other thing, I'm telling you, he said, "But if you link it to this whole thing going on with the Chips and Science Act and the remaking of infrastructure," I'm like, "Did you know that was the other project I'm interested in?" And I saw them as separate. So my literary agent, who's pretty smart, he saw these two things as related. And we're actually, my friends at BCG and I are in the middle of talking about this. But I'll be honest with you, it's hard for me. I'm still at the point where, remember I said I have to build up these typologies? Right. I'm still at the point that so maybe I do another episode later. I still don't know exactly. One of the things I'm trying to do is figure out how they fit together. How this MetaCity, which is more about innovation and innovation flows and high-level talent flows, and maybe this is the new spatial division of labor of production, and it's separate. It's not separate, but those production hubs will be in certain parts of the world connected to the innovation networks, but I'm not sure how. I'm being really honest with you. I haven't figured out how. So if you have any ideas, I'm open to them.
Well, I mean, I think the thing that's shifting now, and some of the conversations that I've had on the podcast, is that the production is getting more innovative. I think that with the movement of the digital into the physical,
yes,
is it's 100%. Not merely harsh assembly line. Like it's not Henry Ford anymore, right? We're thinking about just the whole concept of advanced manufacturing and how to think about, do you bring how software eats the world kind of phrase, and bringing it out, and how we think about hard tech. And so in that report I did for Heartland Forward, I basically said the difference is that in the past we thought about innovation as two things: shifting, moving it to new places, disconnected from production like Silicon Valley, or deepening, applying innovation to like big old incumbent sectors and making them more efficient like Germany does. Now we're talking about shifting and deepening together. And I said, the reason Austin, the reason Nashville, the reason Michigan, and I said to the folks, it's not only about Detroit, it's about Ann Arbor. And I actually in that report looked at Austin, and I said, look at Austin. Here's your Ann Arbor doesn't grow. Austin grows. It becomes bigger. Columbus, where the Intel facilities are outside of Columbus, Ohio State. So I think
part of it is having local research capability. But I think what you're onto, Jason, that I've not thought about, and I need to spend time thinking about, it's not just a local innovation capability, that there's something going on in an Austin. Well, Austin has the University of Texas, it has great engineering programs, and it has a connection to San Francisco. Boom. Maybe that's what needs to happen in the other parts. It's not, and of course, the University of Michigan has great connections to all other great, but it's probably, I'm thinking about this in real time. It's probably the connections of that local innovation and production capability to other external. And of all the places I can think about, see, Pittsburgh would, but it lost its manufacturing base.
Right.
The problem with Pittsburgh is it had to, and like Boston had to shift away from textiles and boot and shoe. Pittsburgh had to shift out of steel because it was dying. Austin was able to remake in computers, computer equipment, electronics, and electric cars and batteries. Detroit obviously has the incumbent automotive, and it has the research at the University of Michigan. Yeah, so it's probably in that, not only most of us economic developers think of localized cluster capabilities. It's probably local plus external.
Right.
It's the network.
It's the stack of how we think about what we are building. So the software, then the capabilities. You think about all of like the robotics that is here. You've got Tesla's Optimus, you got Optronic, all of the new types of the ways that we are building, and then what we are building themselves, whether it be electric cars, rockets, whatever, right? And so to down to the small, the semiconductors. So I think all of that stack in between is what is starting to shift, right? We've been able to do software really well.
If we think about Pittsburgh, then the key to Pittsburgh's future is probably not just building more robots and artificial intelligence, but rethinking about how to build its manufacturing capability around that, because Austin has built both, and I think Nashville too. If you look outside of Nashville, you start to see the same thing with production capability. And now they're thinking long and hard about how they add to the research capability. And of course, they have Oak Ridge and they have Vanderbilt and they have all this other stuff going on. But yeah, I think in this new production system, that it's the local and the network, and thinking long and hard. And for Pittsburgh, it's how does Pittsburgh robotics fit into Austin too?
Yeah, having Pittsburgh, having CMU there, and being able to really have those things break out of the university and into the plant, the home, really understanding where the robots can go and what they can do. If
you ask me, I'm going to say the same thing I said last time. The future of the heartland are real. If I think about the key places, it's Austin, it's Nashville, it's Columbus, and it's Detroit, Ann Arbor. Now, there'll be many other places, but they are the ones in which the future of the middle of the country depends. They're the critical ones. And then they attach to others. But this is something like, if now you're asking me about my intellectual project, how does the meta city idea fit with this other thing? And I can still work that out.
Right. And then you have things like the Vision Pro and just the next layer of remote type of technology so that we can interact. I haven't played with the Vision Pro. And I'm hearing a lot just because, like, for me personally, VR and AR, I get motion sickness. So I'm waiting for them to solve that. But the question is, how can we do that level of interactions even better so that what does it really mean to be in two different places and interacting differently?
What strikes me as so interesting about this is you probably could not think of a time when America was more politically dysfunctional. You look at this election and people are going like, two old people, they're not all there, whether I agree with that or not. And the country in many ways poised at its most innovative and most transformative Schumpeterian moment, where it looks to be defining the technological and production frontier. I don't know. I just find this amazing. Politically, we're dysfunctional. We're supposedly completely divided politically and culturally, yet when we talk about innovation and production and the reshoring of manufacturing, we're like, this place looks incredible. It's just, to me, unbelievable. Like maybe it doesn't matter. This is what it gives me hope. It doesn't matter how politically convoluted we are. Let's just keep driving on economic innovation, production. And, that's why I keep working at the local level, because the local level, regardless of political constellation, always seems to be a place people want to make stuff happen. So for me, I can just tune out the other stuff. If I work in Columbus or Pittsburgh or Austin or Nashville or wherever, I can tune that out and do interesting things.
Always reasons to be optimistic, always reasons to just build and create amazing things.
Yeah.
I think actually that's a great note for us to end on. So I want to end on the same question I always ask. So then what's next, Austin?
Well, hopefully I get to come back. I haven't been in a long time. So we're talking about me doing a visit in September. I haven't been in a long time. I'd have to look at my calendar. I kind of want to see what Austin has become. I hear about the good. I also hear about the bad. I hear about like the crazy blotto tourism downtown and the bachelorette parties. I like all that stuff. I like cities, and I like cities that are messy. So look, I think Austin has really defined something, and the model you've defined is really interesting, and linking three things, which you know better than more than me, linking innovation, university research, high-tech ecosystems, startup ecosystems with popular culture innovation and music and all lifestyle, and not only music, but outdoor recreation, all the things I like, with now a production component. So it's kind of a more full-fledged model. So I like that. And, I think what next for Austin, just keep doing what you're doing.
Fantastic. Richard, thanks for coming back.
Thanks, Jason. And your job is to help me think through, or together think through this thing between the meta city or the innovation city and the production capability. Because I think we put our finger on something big, that is a big issue. Like figuring that out is non-trivial. And it would really help, like the federal efforts. It would help the local efforts. It would help our country think about it. So yeah, I think you and I can put our minds to that.
So what's next, Austin? We're glad you've joined us on this journey. Please subscribe at your favorite podcast catcher, leave us a review, and let your colleagues know about us. This will help us grow the podcast and continue bringing you unique interviews and insights. Thanks again for listening, and see you soon.